Imagine a scenario that sounds impossible. Imagine the United States Navy, the most powerful maritime force in human history, drifting in the North Atlantic, running low on fuel. They radio for permission to dock at a friendly port in Germany or Italy, allies who have stood by the U.S. for 75 years. But the response is silence, permission denied. Imagine a U.S. soldier injured in a covert operation in the Middle East, being flown urgently to a specialized medical facility in Europe, only to be turned away. This is not a scene from a dystopian movie. This is a very real, very dangerous geopolitical possibility that is being discussed right now, behind closed doors in the highest corridors of power in London, Paris, and Berlin. We often talk about American sanctions crippling other nations, but today we need to talk about the nuclear option that Europe holds against the United States, a logistical blockade that could paralyze the U.S. military machine. Why are we talking about this today? Because on January 6, 2026, the world woke up to a new map, a map posted by the White House Inner Circle that shows Greenland draped in the American flag with a single chilling word: soon. Following the shock U.S. raid on Venezuela, Europe has drawn a red line. They're saying that if the U.S. moves on Greenland, it is the end of NATO. Hello and welcome. Today, we are doing a deep dive into the secret European weapon. We need to understand how a dispute over an ice-covered island has triggered a standoff that could dismantle the Western alliance, and why experts are warning that Europe has the power to stop the U.S. military in its tracks. To understand the gravity of this situation, we first have to connect the dots. This isn't just about Greenland. This story actually starts in South America. Just days ago, the world witnessed a massive shift in U.S. foreign policy. Elite U.S. troops executed a midnight raid in Venezuela, seizing President Nicolás Maduro and flying him to New York to face charges. The White House declared that the U.S. is returning to the Monroe Doctrine, the 1823 policy that says the Western Hemisphere is the United States' backyard, and they will use force to secure it. President Trump didn't just stop at the raid. He announced that Venezuela would be turning over 50 million barrels of oil to the U.S., framing this as a massive economic win. But the message sent to the world was much darker. As Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff, told CNN in a very revealing interview, "We live in a world that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power." He explicitly dismissed international niceties. This brings us to the soon map. Immediately after the Venezuela operation showed that the U.S. is willing to decapitate a foreign government to secure its interests, eyes turned north. Katie Miller, the wife of Stephen Miller, posted an image of Greenland, an autonomous territory of Denmark, colored in the American flag with the caption, "Soon." This sent shockwaves through Europe. Why? Because if the U.S. is willing to raid Venezuela, a sovereign nation, what stops them from doing the same to Greenland? You might ask, why does the U.S. care so much about an island with only 57,000 people? Here is the geopolitical reality. This is not about real estate. This is about survival and dominance. First, rare earth minerals. Greenland is sitting on a treasure trove of minerals essential for high-tech sectors, and Washington is desperate to break its reliance on Chinese exports. Second, and more importantly, the Golden Dome. Sources from the Chatham House think tank reveal that the U.S. wants to build a Golden Dome missile defense system. If Russia were to fire nuclear missiles at the United States, their trajectory would take them right over the Arctic and Greenland. To shoot them down, the U.S. needs interceptors stationed there. Now, the U.S. already has a base there, Thule or Pituffik Air Base. It has been there since 1943, but under the current strength and power doctrine, access is not enough. They want sovereignty. They want full control, likely to deploy systems that Denmark might otherwise veto. This demand has pushed Europe into a corner, and this is where the situation gets unprecedented. On January 6, 2026, for the first time in recent history, the major powers of Europe, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and Denmark, issued a joint statement against the United States. They declared Greenland belongs to its people. The Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, dropped a diplomatic bombshell. She warned that if the U.S. chooses to attack or annex Greenland, it would mean the end of NATO. She said if the U.S. chooses to attack another NATO country militarily, then everything stops. Think about what that means. NATO is built on Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. If the US, the leader of NATO, attacks or coerces another, Denmark, the logic collapses. But here's the deep dive analysis that you won't hear on the nightly news. Most people think if NATO collapses, Europe loses its security and the US walks away fine. But a new analysis by Chatham House suggests the opposite. They argue that Europe is not helpless. In fact, they have a secret weapon, a logistical stranglehold that could bring US global operations to a halt. Let's analyze this blockade scenario. The US military is a global giant, but it's a giant that needs to eat, sleep, and refuel. Currently, the US maintains massive bases in Germany, like Ramstein Air Base, Italy, and the UK. These aren't just for protecting Europe, they're the logistical hubs for US operations in the Middle East, Africa, and the High North. If the US pushes forward with a hostile takeover of Greenland, European allies could activate what experts are calling unthinkable measures. First, the refueling ban. European nations could refuse to refuel US ships in their ports. Imagine a US carrier strike group heading to the Mediterranean or the Persian Gulf. If they cannot dock in Spain, Italy, or Gibraltar to resupply, their operational range is severely cut. They would be stranded logistically. Second, the medical blockade. This is perhaps the shocking point raised by security experts. Europe could refuse to accept injured military personnel for treatment in European military hospitals. For decades, US soldiers wounded in Iraq or Afghanistan have been flown to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany for life-saving treatment. If Europe closes this door, the US military's ability to sustain high-risk operations in the Middle East evaporates. Third, base closures. The US projects power because it has bases everywhere, but those bases exist because host countries allow them. If Denmark, backed by Germany and France, decides that the US is now a hostile actor, they could propose closing these installations or charging exorbitant fees that make them impossible to maintain. As Chatham House notes, removing these bases would make US operations in the Middle East and the Arctic much harder. The US would be isolated, forced to retreat to its own hemisphere. The counter-argument from the American side, led by figures like Stephen Miller, is that nobody's going to fight the US militarily. And strictly speaking, they're right. Denmark is not going to shoot at US Navy SEALs. But in the 21st century, war is not just about shooting. It's about logistics, alliances, and law. If the US annexes Greenland, it breaches the North Atlantic Treaty. If NATO dissolves, the US loses its force multiplier. Look at the response from the European leaders. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Macron, and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz are standing shoulder to shoulder. They're effectively saying, "We will not be bullied." Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk put it bluntly, NATO would lose its meaning if one member attacks another. So where does this leave us? We are seeing a game of chicken with the highest possible stakes. On one side, a US administration driven by a desire for absolute security, the Golden Dome, and resource dominance, emboldened by a successful raid in Venezuela. They believe the world is governed only by strength and force. On the other side, a united Europe that realizes if they let Greenland go, they're essentially becoming vassal states. They're signaling that they have leverage, the power to turn off the lights at US bases, the power to turn away US ships, the power to dismantle the infrastructure that makes the US a superpower. The question for the American audience is this: is Greenland worth it? Is a missile defense system and rare earth minerals worth sacrificing the alliance that won the Cold War? Because if the soon map becomes reality and US troops land in Nuuk to raise the stars and stripes, the next sound you hear might be the closing of doors across Europe, locking the US out of the Eastern Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine might secure the Americas, but it could cost the United States the rest of the world. This is a developing story, and the geopolitical map is being redrawn as we speak. We will keep watching.